This is the third video in my top 3 tips series on the things that, since returning to piano some 5 years and maybe 3,000 hours of practice ago, have helped me, I think, the most. The first tip was on breaking something down beyond simple sections. The second was on how we can use practice variants to practice the smallest of our building blocks. And now my tip is around how we go about recombining these into a piece. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists, or indeed anyone who loves piano, to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If this is your first trip, then please do think about subscribing to Tommy's Piano Corner. Just click on the little icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. You'll find links to the first 2 of the videos in this series in the description below, and also at the end of this one if you haven't yet seen them. Today, we're going to look at how we can go about building a piece up as our snippets are coming under control thanks to our practice variants. For me, part of this discovery was in fact that it occurred to me one day that most things on piano aren't particularly difficult per se. Now, before you think I've gone mad, just let me try to explain. What I mean is that in the last video we talked about octaves and how I wasn't particularly confident with them. However, if we look at a single octave, then it's not particularly difficult to do, unless of course your hands are extremely small and you can't reach. So I'm sure most of us can manage an octave with either hand. What makes octaves difficult though is the number of them that we need to do in succession. 1 octave, easy enough. 2 octaves, probably still straightforward. 3 or more, and we're perhaps starting to enter into different territory. Certainly, by the time we've got a couple of measures of them, then we could be in some serious trouble. Similarly, many of us find speed to be a challenge. Yet playing 2 or 3 notes fast is something that we can get used to relatively quickly. Think for example of a mordant. Again, what causes the issue is if we need to keep that speed going for a much longer period. So think of a long trill, for example. Thus, we can quickly start running into trouble if we don't start stringing things together in a careful manner, which is what we'll be looking at today. Let me demonstrate how we can approach this with a segment that I found tricky, as I think this demonstrates the idea better than something I could straight away play with relative ease. So let's look at this little bit of Chopin's Etude number 3 in E. I mean, in full disclosure, I can't play well enough to play the entire piece, but I think we can basically abridge it by missing out this extremely difficult passage here. If we think of this as my section then, I split it into 4 very similar segments. And each of these segments I split into 4 snippets. Initially, I practiced the snippets using the quarto exercises from his edition of the Etudes. Eventually, this got me to the point where I had 3 main practice variants, plus of course their performance one that we've talked about. So of course, as we feel these coming under control, we can start to add them together. However, we do need to be careful, as there are a couple of pitfalls that I've noticed. The first is that I'd often start trying to add snippets together as I felt I could just about by the skin of my teeth, as it were, manage them. But this doesn't particularly work. I think we need to start feeling that they're getting easy to play. The second pitfall is adding too many snippets together at a time. This is simply because I think the more notes we need to control in succession, the more difficult something feels. And of course, the more difficult something feels, the more likely it is to go wrong. Therefore, it's very useful to have intermediate stages. One first thing I notice is that we often find that one or more of our practice variants starts to feel easy, as it were, well before the others do. In this example, I found the dotted rhythm variant was the first one that felt quite easy to do. So a first step can be to add the snippets together into their segment using this particular variant. This gets us already into the habit of playing a longer sequence of notes. For added security, I found it helpful to first add them together one snippet at a time with a pause in between each one. And I discussed the idea of the power pause in a previous video. The power pause is basically an opportunity to do a mental check on what's coming next. We then keep up this process until we have all the snippets in that segment in succession. Now we can start to remove the pause. However, we do this by removing one pause at a time. Always let yourself be guided by the music and try to keep things following its design as well as you possibly can. As we move from one stage to another, it should feel a little more difficult, but always manageable. In this way, with a little practice, it will start to feel easy. Now, just how much time this process might take really depends on how challenging we find the material. For some pieces, we might be able to do all of this in a single practice session. For others, it might take much longer. The key is always to ensure that as we practice, we aren't simply sitting there playing wrong note after wrong note. When this is the case, we've moved forward too quickly. However, at the same time, we still do need to be challenging ourselves a little so that we are making progress. Often we'll find that as we add things together, this might add a manageable mistake, which I've spoken of before. And this is something that we'll be able to fix, so perhaps just one wrong note here and there. Another thing we can do is what I call looping. Now, this largely depends on the music concerned. However, often we can loop something quite naturally, really. So if we take this part here, we can see that it's already repeated by Chopin. Therefore, we can start to loop it 3, 4 or more times if we want to. I found this can really help in that we're playing many more notes in succession, however, made slightly easier by the fact that we're repeating the same ones. And as I said in my variants video, often when we're practicing, we're still looking to make something easier for ourselves so that we're actually able to practice it. Otherwise, if we were trying to play it as written, we might not be able to. Another helpful idea is starting to practice something from a previous snippet. Often our snippets will contain something with a very similar pattern, and it's going from one pattern to another that can sometimes cause us to stumble. Therefore, here as we build up a segment, we can start practicing from the previous one so that we're also adding the change in pattern to our routine. Now, as we feel that a segment is coming under control, even with a practice variant, we can start adding the segments themselves together. Again, a helpful first step is to do this with a pause between each segment. The same rules apply. We're working on getting this to the point that it starts to feel easy with progressively more and more notes. Ultimately, we want to get to the point where we're able to practice the entire section in a reliable manner. Similarly, as we get to the stage that we feel we can manage the performance variant of our snippets, then we can start combining these into segments in exactly the same way. Again, we can use the power pause with 2 snippets at a time. Again, let's not rush the process though. The more awkward we find something, the longer this will take. Once we have an entire section with practice variants as well as with the performance variant, we can start to think a little bit about the rehearsing stage. I firmly believe that we need to get into the habit of rehearsing music, whereby we'll actually play through it and we're no longer focusing on just getting the notes right. However, we might find that there's maybe one little bit that still gives us trouble and that we can't always play reliably. Now, I used to just fluff my way through these kind of things on the basis that, well, I'll fix it later. However, I'm fairly convinced that this approach simply builds in, sort of unreliable muscle memory that then is hard to change later. If this is the case, then for that part, consciously use one of the practice variants you can reliably manage. So, for example, I struggled for a long time to get this particular little fioritura under control in Chopin's A-flat waltz. And so, when rehearsing it, I opted to insert my power pause just here every time I practiced it end to end. I only worked on removing the pause when working on individual snippets and segments, and not when in rehearsing mode. Another issue you might find is that of hitting a wall. This can happen, for example, if you're like me and insist on learning things that perhaps are strictly speaking a bit too difficult. Here, an amazingly useful tactic is to simply put it to one side for a while. We've used our sections, segments and snippets combined with our practice variants, and we've been practicing something in a manner I believe is sensible. In that we're not simply sitting there trying to get something done by brute force, as it were. We're building something up piece by piece. However, we still might find that at times we do hit a wall. And in these cases, there's no shame in setting something aside for a while and letting it marinate, as it were. Sometimes I might do this for a couple of weeks, sometimes even for a few months. What I found is that if I start to find myself avoiding practicing something, which does happen, then I should probably trust my gut feeling and not force it anymore. I think that often we get too close to the problem and we're unable to find a solution, and this makes us frustrated. And of course, practicing with this type of frustration is almost certainly going to be counterproductive. Often, when we return to something after a break, we start to have much more imaginative ideas as to how we can overcome whatever the difficulty is. Equally, if it's a particular thing that seems to be causing the issue, we can search out music that has that same idea to work on instead, perhaps even in a simplified manner. So take, for example, the famous polyrhythm 3/2 from Debussy's first arabesque. If we don't feel that this is becoming easier, we could practice something like Grandos Canción de Mayo, which has a very similar polyrhythm, but the notes are somewhat simpler. The right hand's just a simple scale upwards. This is somewhat easier than the polyrhythm in the arabesque, or at least I thought so. What I found though is that when we then come back to the arabesque, it's surprising how much easier it feels to practice. As an aside, I use my sight reading as an opportunity to find features in music with different challenges and keep a list of them so I can consult it later when I find something I need. So there you have my 3 top tips, which when combined together I've found get me, I'd say 80% of the way there with most music. I'm not saying they'll fix every problem, of course they won't, and there are a lot of other techniques that we can use for specific thorny issues. Again, my go-to resource for ideas of how to practice different passages is still Graham Fitch's ebook series on practicing the piano. And I've linked that here for you as always. You'll find hundreds, probably thousands of extremely helpful ideas there. And then another amazingly helpful resource is Rami Barniv's book, The Art of Piano Fingering, which takes you through everything from basic fingering concepts to actually quite advanced ones. Also, check out my practice ideas playlist for different things I've discovered, often by combining different techniques or ideas. All illustrated using pieces I've learned myself over the past few years. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.